So these, as Taryn indicated, are quarterly events which attempt to emphasize two things that we care a lot at the Divinity School. One is the productivity of our faculty, which nourishes the institution in a variety of ways in terms of teaching and the like, and also collegiality among faculty. And so the point of the forum is both to celebrate publication and also to invite colleagues whose expertise, as I'm sure the respondents today will both rehearse at short length to you, is not directly related to that of the book that they're talking about. So the idea is that we can have conversation in which people who work in literary criticism and philosophy of religion can talk to theologians and biblical scholars, to pick a random example. So the format is that Professor Chavel and then Professor Hector will each offer remarks about Sarah Hammerschlag's book, Broken Tablets, Levinas, Derrida, and the Literary Afterlife of Religion. After they do that, Professor Hammerschlag, will have the chance to respond to their comments, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. So I just want to say in advance thanks to my colleagues who are here today. It's a delight to see you all lined up so in such orderly fashion there. And I'll turn it over to Professor Chavel, who is going first.
Thank you. I am asked to respond to Sarah Hammerschlag's Broken Tablets, Levinas, Derrida, and the Literary Afterlife of Religion in 10 minutes. I'm Spinal Tap. I get to 11. Broken Tablets is beyond my ken. Levinas, Derrida, the Afterlife, beyond my ken. The first 4 chapters, dense and intense, weave citations into a thicket of ideas. In the final chapter, the weaver speaks in her own voice about the weave. The thicket becomes a manicured hedge by Edward Scissorhands. I enjoy yielding to the treacherous sensation of understanding. The epilogue is positively delicious in the secrets it serves up. Following this trend, I begin at the end, the blurbs, the very last blurb. Martin J. calls Broken Tablets trenchant, masterful, and four-dimensional. Time, you see, plays an organic role in this history of ideas, which really is a history of people and their ideas. Specific individuals with highly circumstantial ideas and their shifting entailments, which move between inchoate, explicit, and qualified iterations, and not often in that convenient order. Moreover, their idiom shifts repeatedly. The troposphere never stilts. Each articulation depends on timing, on the situation, the prompt, and the audience. So to encompass an idea, grasp it, squeeze, and feel which way it's oozing between your fingers this time as opposed to last. Hold off that sneaking sensation you have got hold of the whole. Time in Broken Tablets does not just feature in the history of ideas, but rides it with a hard hand, bending, warping, looping back. Neither linear nor stable, it is profoundly relative and dynamic. Ideas, the work argues, are not. They always become and ever were. Plus, they shift with the stance of the observer. Broken Tablets itself begins with ends, which it analyzes as signs of signifieds, moments like eulogies, words like irony, traces of the ever-absent, secrets not to have a future. Nothing ever just is or becomes, but always is because it was, or has a was, or insists it does, insists it was. Dr. Seuss. In its necessary implication of its was, in its disclosure of its was, every is a betrayal. For every was at the time thought itself an is. To yoke a was to the becoming of an is, to make a prior is now into a was, undermines its integrity, belies its claim, claims to reveal a secret that cannot, that has no revelation. In Broken Tablets, religion is the was, insisted by literature, necessary to literature, and necessarily betrayed by literature. At issue, says Broken Tablets, are collective identities, the politics of the thing, which calls to mind Dan Miron's 1985 history, in which literature and the literary figure replace religion and the rabbi in the rise of the State of Israel. Broken tablets, the tablets of a covenant, pieces of covenantal text laying in shards, the language you know, the script you use, words ever on your tongue. You could put it back together. You won't. You wouldn't dare. The symbolism, the significance forbids it. It's not the words, it's what on the tablet they signify. If you're an Israelite, you heard those urgent words directly, irrefutably, irrevocably, and unforgettably. You don't even need the written text. But the symbolism of the written tablet and its pieces haunts you. You didn't quite shatter it, but you determined its shattering. Divine speech, even divine speech, especially divine speech is doomed to fail, written like spoken. But you use the pieces to say something new, something your own. You insist on it. Hermeneutic ingenuity lives by incongruity. Real closeness is so doomed to betrayal, and real betrayal bespeaks and affirms a prior causal abiding closeness. Every writing is a rewriting for better and for worse. This is ironic. Actually, says Broken Tablets, this is irony. The betrayal of intimacy and the intimacy of betrayal are the quintessence of it, its very definition. Irony presupposes sharedness, activates it, then turns it against itself one way or the other. Every sharer is an Israelite, every writer more so. Broken Tablets. The title of the book brilliantly captures its content, its method, its style, and its argument. How dare I respond to it, to the challenge it poses? Dare I betray? Well, who doesn't want to affirm closeness? There is social capital to gain. Ironic exclamation point. Not to mention growing and incipient friendship. But will it ring true, a good and proper betrayal? Conflict avoid and forego true gain? Or risk all, affirm closeness, and betray? Claim it was and it is all at once. It is the latter I fear, but it will be the latter I fear. Argued actually, is that betrayal is ethical. And the risk? It's the very ethics of the thing. Broken tablets. There is another tablet in biblical idiom, the tablet that is the heart, the seat of thought. In the idiom's trope, one can inscribe it and dictate the terms of one's personality and commitments. This requires it be fleshy fresh, pliable, impressionable, not hard like stone, dry and fixed, baked for 1,000 years. In the book of Proverbs, a book collecting varieties of instructional speech, an authority speaking to a son warns him not to not hear, but to inscribe his parents' teaching on the unbreakable tablet that is his heart. As we say today, to internalize. There is, should be his is, no was, here. And is controlling what will be, asserting itself timelessly, as every is does, but in this special case, quintessentially. One jarring, unframed speech in Proverbs lists the many ways any new is a betrayal, a denial of parents that unravels the social fabric. Our modern notion of parental love makes of this an irony, but of the Abraham modern still model, Yahweh says, I revealed myself to him, so he will impress my ways upon his family and household. Rabbi Simlai of Talmudic existence imagines every curled up fetus a pinkas, a chain of writing slats, folded up one upon the other, inscribed with the entire Torah. Elsewhere in the Bible, a mixed metaphor has the heart pruned and cultivated, marked and enculturated, branded and ready to receive, incised and circumcised. How ironic I feel that Abraham, father of all fathers, protects his is, launching it quantumly into eternity and timelessness, prevents it becoming a was by sacrificing the next is, the son promised him as part of his own is. The irony here cuts the other way. The father betrays the son, hands him over, serves him up, cuts him down. How iconically the episode serves so many. How ironically it betrays its retellers. Broken tablets, broken hearts, broken figures, textual shards. The Bible is a container of literary fragments, a jar full of shards, each grasped as a whole and wholly representative. A was-looking potential is really, activated fleetingly as a past is, just to be made a once was for the sake of a now is. Literary snips and strips eerily mistaken for religion. Narratives of characters, causes, and results, fields of reference constituted by nouns and past tense verbs, refer together to nothing but their own grammaticalized assertions and grow in assertiveness with every new reinforcing sign. A boat built under one's feet while rowing in the sea, so Harshav, or subatomic particles made of the flimsiest and most fleeting matter empowered by proximity. Broken tablets, broken records. For Levinas, I get the impression religion has many ises and wases. Once literature, twice ritual as exercise, a la Maimonides and Mendelssohn, thrice kiddush, holiness as separation, othering, and otherwise. I would say making special and specialing, or making treasured and treasuring, with all the entailments and a clear admission of the self. Derrida seems devoted to returning to Levinas and betraying him time after time. Is that not religion? Is it literature after religion or literature as religion? How different from literature is religion? Movement and meaning around the missing. What are both but human imagination simultaneously facilitated and constrained by limitation and the alleged real? There is a difference. I might say it turns on commitment and compulsion, a difference between earnestness and play. In a line I love, Broken Tablets distinguishes identically between truth and taste. With a conceptualization I really appreciate, Broken Tablets describes literature's project and problem as turning religion from rule and regulation to resource. Well, fancy that. From my little intellectual corner, I've opened no new vistas, shed no uncanny light, but backed myself into your very argument, haven't I? Epic fail. No triumphant betrayal here, after all, just of myself and you, the audience. This much I can say of Broken Tablets. It has magically enfleshed my tablet and inscribed my heart anew. No exclamation point. With the earnestness of the period, thank you.
And now for something completely different. I regularly tell people that I have a much better job than I deserve. One reason why that's so, and one reason why people usually agree with me, is because I get to work with people like Sarah Hammerschlag. Professor Hammerschlag is already a star in her fields, but she's also a generous, highly valued, and frankly brilliant colleague and teacher. I am honored to work with her accordingly, and honored to be part of this conversation about her second book, Broken Tablets. There's much to admire about this book. For one thing, Professor Hammerschlag knows her way around French philosophy better than I know my way around my house. That would be more of a compliment if I was really good at knowing my way. For another, Professor Hammerschlag brings an abundance of fresh insight to this material, helping us to see not only what these figures argued, nor only why these arguments mattered, but what their larger implications are for the relationship between religion, literature, and politics. This is, in sum, a major work. The work of someone who not only commands a field, but has something important to contribute to it. I could spend all of my allotted time, therefore, praising this book, but I gather that that's not what I've been asked to do, and in any case, I do have some questions about one of its claims, and I would be interested to hear what Professor Hammerschlag has to say about them. These questions are a response to Professor Hammerschlag's claim that this book has, quote, wider implications for us going forward, end quote, particularly with respect to politics. Each of my questions thus concerns the book's implications for democracy, and in particular, Professor Hammerschlag's insistence against those who maintain that the problem with irony is, quote, its supposed lack of orientation, end quote, that irony would, in fact, quote, orient us toward justice, end quote. To understand why its critics would suppose that irony lacks orientation, it is important to say something before proceeding about Professor Hammerschlag's Derridian understanding of irony itself. At the most basic level, an irony may obtain only when there is a conflict between what a subject says or does on the one hand and what he or she intends on the other. This is what Professor Hammerschlag has in mind, I take it, when she asserts that irony, quote, belies its expressed intention, end quote. Derrida's view of irony goes well beyond this garden-level understanding, however, for in light of his claims about pan-textuality, Derrida thinks that irony, in the sense of a conflict between what is said or done on the one hand and what one intends on the other, obtains everywhere. This explains why he thinks that, quote, irony, in some sense, is always already at work, end quote. From this, Derrida draws a decisive inference, namely that irony cannot serve to, quote, unmask the discrepancy between the real and the ideal, end quote, since it must equally unmask and so render undecidable these very ideals themselves. For Derrida, then, it's irony, and therefore undecidability, instability, and unknowability all the way down, which brings me back to my basic question. Would the proliferation and perception of irony in this sense actually orient us toward justice? There are at least three ways in which Professor Hammerschlag contends that it would do so. We are told first that irony is a powerful weapon against domination and discrimination, precisely because such destabilization would undermine the taken-for-granted rectitude of the self-righteous, or in literary idiom, of the alazon. As Professor Hammerschlag puts it, if the target of irony is indeed the alazon, that is, the one who thinks he has not only the answers, but also the right to decide who is on the side of virtue and who is not, then the very fact of irony's destabilizing quality would make it a propedeutic of another sort, one that operates counter to a will to domination, counter to a will of discrimination, end quote. Here, then, Derridian irony is called upon to undermine the self-assuredly self-righteous, and thus to undermine the domination and discrimination that they mean to impose. This is an attractive conclusion if we think of its target as, say, activists from Westboro Baptist Church. Just insofar as we think it's attractive, however, because, say, Westboro Baptist's hatefulness is wrong, Derridian irony would undermine us too, along with anyone else who would make any such moral judgment. For as soon as we do so, we too are in the position of the alazon. On Derrida's view, recall, irony and undecidability apply all the way down, and not only to positions that we perceive to be unjust. And so I wonder, does that really leave us better off justice-wise? That is to say, does it really promote justice if we can never say unironically that, quote, there are people who are wrong, end quote? Here I'm quoting a line from Levinas, it's worth noting, that is cited with apparent disapproval in the text. Right? So can we say unironically, under this rubric, there are people who are wrong? We can come at the same point from a different angle. We're elsewhere told that once we see irony everywhere, when, quote, all hypotheses are permitted, groundless and ad infinitum, end quote, that this will orient us to justice. But I wonder if that's what we would think if we applied this principle to, say, phony debates over climate change or voter fraud. In these debates, experts in climatology and political science cite overwhelming evidence to establish the truth of certain propositions and insist that those who disagree with these propositions are wrong. Against this, one surprisingly or maybe depressingly effective response has been simply to interject competing explanations in order to give people the impression that, well, the issue is undecidable. In such cases, I wonder, do we really think that the introduction of undecidability, instability, and unknowability by itself orients us to justice? I have a hard time seeing why that would be so. The orientation seems to me ambivalent at best. That brings us to a second claim to the effect that irony is oriented toward justice, namely that it undercuts a conception of sovereignty that supposedly justifies the dominion of some over others. Sovereignty here means something along the lines of unconditioned, self-determining, self-caused subjectivity, and such sovereignty is that which supposedly justifies, quote, the concentration in so few hands of so much power, end quote, for the apparent reason that one can see oneself as wholly self-grounded, and thus as a wholly independent actor vis-a-vis others, only on the basis of some such conception. Against this, one might simply point out with Elizabeth Warren all of the ways that such persons didn't build that, the manifold ways, that is, that they depend upon others. But Derrida pursues a more radical approach, wherein the alleged unconditionedness, allegedly at the root of such sovereignty, namely the unconditionedness of reason, is called fundamentally into question by means of irony. His strategy here is thus to, quote, behead the king that reigns within our very conception of what we think it means to think, where this involves mobilizing the literary structures within reason itself, finding its fictions and making them function as such, end quote. Derrida thus seems to think that if he can undermine reason by exhibiting its fundamental instability, undecidability, etc., then he will undermine a particular conception of sovereignty, and that if he undermines that conception, he will likewise undermine the concentration of power that it supposedly justifies. Ironism might thus appear to move us in the direction of justice, but once again, I'm not sure. For one thing, I worry that if we undercut reason, we might lose a powerful justification not only of sovereignty, but of the modern idea of rights, since the latter too are built upon a foundation of unconditioned, inviolable, dignity-conferring subjecthood. The latter idea has arguably done more to promote justice than any other in history. That's a little bit much. So I would be especially reluctant to part with it. And I'm not sure the payoff for doing so would be worth it in any case. Frankly, since it's not clear just how much the power of the powerful actually depends upon an Enlightenment notion of reason. To put it bluntly, I highly doubt that Steve Bannon or the Koch brothers would lose one bit of power or give up one bit of power if they were to admit that reason, and therefore their sovereignty, is finally ungrounded. Whereas the powerless would lose one of their most powerful weapons against the powerful if they were to admit that the idea of human rights is similarly ungrounded. Here again, then, pan-ironism seems ambivalent at best in its relation to justice. And I suspect, by the way, that ambivalence here would function as a kind of regressive tax, since taking the same thing away from the powerful and the powerless would hurt the latter far more than the former, or so it seems to me. That brings us to a third way that irony is supposed to promote justice, namely by calling universals into question and just so protecting the singularity of every capital O other. Derridian ironism is thus supposed to, quote, respect the absolute, absolutely irreducible, untranslatable idiom of the other, end quote, and to do this by exhibiting, quote, the disruption between the singular and the universal, end quote. Such disruption calls attention to a peculiar and pervasive irony, namely the irony of using words or concepts to represent a singular other, for words and concepts traffic in that which is repeatable, iterable, or universal, such that to use them to speak of or think about a singular other would thereby be to betray that other. This is why Derrida claims, for instance, that, quote, the effacement of singularity is present as soon as there are words, or again, that when the other announces itself as such, it presents itself in the dissimulation of itself, end quote. There's a profound irony here, accordingly, but this is supposed to be good news, for as soon as we learn to spot this irony, we become aware that the otherness of the other always eludes our words, our conceptual grasp. Derridian ironism is thus supposed to protect otherness and just so to promote justice. This is an attractive claim, but I wonder yet again whether it would indeed orient us toward justice. To see why, consider a scenario like the following. Suppose a wealthy white presidential candidate characterizes all African Americans in the following terms. You're living in poverty, he says. Your schools are no good. You have no jobs, and so on. Now suppose that someone stands up to him and says, not all African Americans live in inner cities, as a matter of fact, nor are all African Americans poor, or jobless, or poorly educated, and so on. In this scenario, the presidential candidate's use of stereotypes obviously occludes the particularities of the persons to whom he is applying them. As such, it might actually promote justice if his words were subjected to Derridian ironism. That is, if we were reminded of the fact that singular others always elude every conceptualization. The problem, though, is that if we follow Derrida, the exact same thing must be said of the words used to oppose those stereotypes, since the very act of speaking not only betrays the singularities of which one would speak, but because singularity is here construed in absolute terms, there's finally no decidable difference between betraying that singularity by invoking bigoted stereotypes and doing so by speaking out against such stereotypes. In the Pan-Ironist's Night, accordingly, all cats are gray, since it equally undermines those whose words promote justice and those whose words hinder it. Again, then, irony is here supposed to play a key role in orienting politics toward justice, but I have a hard time seeing how it would do so, especially absent a substantive conception of justice of the sort forbidden under the reign of Pan-Ironism. I strongly suspect, then, that I'm missing something. I say this without irony, utterly without irony. I honestly suspect that I'm missing something. I'm playing away, not at home. And I would be grateful if Professor Hammerschlag would help me see what that is, and it would be especially helpful if she could do so in connection with some of the examples of the sort that I've been talking about, because I'm a bit of a Missourian when it comes to understanding things. I look forward to our conversation accordingly, but in the meantime, let me reiterate my genuine appreciation for this fine book, as well as my sincere admiration for its author. Thank you.
So first I want to thank Kevin Hector and Simeon Chavel for taking the time, especially at this particularly busy time of year, and also Dean Rosengarten for presiding. These are the kind of events these deans for that highlight some of the things that I love most about this place, the particular breed of collegiality that is its ethic, not mere politeness or even fellowship, but a commitment to engage the ideas of others with seriousness, and really a dedication that I think is among the highest of scholarly virtues. I see this here, and I saw this also in the guest lectures that so many faculty gave in my intro class, so I'm sincerely grateful for that. I want to say thank you particularly, I want to say thank you to both of you really for the content of what you put forward, and I want to try to frame the nature of what I see as your critiques. I'm particularly grateful for Kevin because these are these questions that need to be discussed, and so I appreciate the fact that you pointed that. But Simeon, let me just say that I heard in your remarks the particular contention that the division between religion and literature in some sense is too strong in the book, that in fact if one thinks about the way in which biblical texts operate, they already include so many of the features that one might associate with literature. And I absolutely do not disagree with that, and yet the one thing I'd want to say has to do with the nature of authority that I think is intrinsic to religious community and what it means to read within religious community and how the same dynamics of literary texts versus religious texts function differently depending on the nature of that authority. And so for me, what's interesting about Derrida, and particularly in his late work, is the way in which one can begin to see that with all texts, there's a kind of promise for the revelation of truth that one will have in and through the reading. There's a promise that is deferred about that definitive truth. And any of the students in my literary criticism class can speak to the way in which we saw this circulate when we look at 20th century literary criticism. But that within religious communities, the power dynamic of authority and the nature of religious truth functions in such a way that it undergirds authority, and that literature can actually reveal the similarities between the way texts operate within religious communities and within literary reading practices, and the conjunction between the two can actually expose that parallel, and that one can see that the promise, it too, is parallel, but that the difference between that promise, when one knows at the end of the novel, damn it, I'm just not going to find out. I'm just not going to get the answer. I'm going to pose it, and I'm going to insist on the authority of my interpretation, but I'm not going to know. And the way in which that promise gets deferred in religious context, and I say that as a blanket statement, which of course can be challenged, but I do think within religious reading practices, the sense in which that promise becomes a way to wield adhesion to doctrine, adhesion to community, and then it creates the sort of an insider-outsider dynamic in which to be the one who is in the know is one of the ways in which one protects the impossibility of the revelation of the final answer. So that's the nature of the distinction that I want to draw. Kevin, thanks for putting so clearly the issue that I think in our particular moment I have to address. And obviously I have thought enormously about this since the appearance of Trump on the scene. And I think that there are a couple things worth saying. So I've been thinking about this. I'm actually thinking about writing a piece on this that's longer. And the thing that first came to mind was the obituary that was in the New York Times after Derrida died, in which he was called a charlatan. And in some sense, the challenge that you're posing is to suggest that post-structuralism actually creates the shifting ground in which nobody can be anything but a charlatan. Or that it takes away from us the certainty, supposedly, of facts and of the certain idea of the subject within the liberal tradition, right? And I guess what I was struck by in thinking through this idea of the charlatan is the fundamental difference between the way in which Derrida wields uncertainty and uncertainty is being wielded by a particular version of the right now. And that difference has to do with power and authority, and it has to do with scrutiny. So let's take the very idea of the promise and plagiarism, okay? So one of Derrida's concepts is that every speech act involves a promise, I will be faithful to you. And every speech act also at the same time involves a plagiarism. That because insofar as I begin representing myself to you, the distance between my intention and what I say always appears. That this concomitant, what he called a double bind, between that promise and that plagiarism is fundamental to every speech act. Now one could say that creates a shifting ground. But what it creates more than anything is a kind of scrutiny that one has to put into motion with every single speech act. And that scrutiny is actually a political ethic of humility. So the term justice actually appears very rarely in this book. There's an emphasis in your response on justice. I am interested in the political consequences of thinking about the relationship between religion and literature. Much of that has to do with the nature of political subjectivity more than anything, and the kind of political subject who is aware of the kind of scrutiny that should be a part of every speech act. And that kind of humility and scrutiny is the thing that is most lacking on the right. And then if, in fact, you might say that one of the faults of the left is that they still insist on a kind of scrutiny. And we talk about something like climate change. It's a very interesting example. The thing about a certain form of the scientific method is that it can involve this kind of scrutiny in which every argument that you put forward, every finding you have is provisional. And there's something about the very quality of a political actor as provisional, which I think is at the heart of what I see as a political virtue, let's say, in the project that I'm posing. There are also ways in which scientists can be blind to the fact that their findings are provisional. They can be blind to the fact that their method is sometimes ungrounded in the scrutiny that needs to be undertaken in order to make that method the strongest that it possibly can. And when that happens, science develops its own kind of arrogance. And that, at this particular moment, may not be the arrogance that we're most concerned about, but is it an arrogance that we should be concerned about? And it's something that, of course, we are concerned about as scholars of religion. The reason that I love being in the field of religion is that I think that people who work within the context of tradition tend to be more aware of the kinds of rubrics that undergird their statements. They're self-aware about them. And I think that scientists aren't always as self-aware. And I think that when we converse with scientists, many of us take pride in the kind of self-awareness that's involved in being a scholar of religion. So I don't think that answers all of your concerns. I think that the question of how we use the term fact, I don't think that Derrida actually ever undermines the very possibility of there being facts, and I certainly don't think that Derrida ever undermines reason. And let me be clear about this, and I'll stop after this, but I think it's important to say that to rethink the nature of the autonomous subject in no way means a departure from reason, but it means that one recognizes that, and I think Kant, a certain reading of Kant recognizes this too, that there is a certain fiction that is necessary to the claim of autonomy, and that there are ways in which sometimes we embolden the idea of freedom and the nature of autonomy in such a sense that we aren't aware of the fictions that enable us to make those kinds of claims. And that I think that an awareness of those kinds of fictions is extremely politically productive. Why? Because it involves the possibility of a kind of dialogue in which perspective is always honored, in which the necessity of having to argue for your points rather than assuming that your points, because you speak from a position of being a scientific expert, are taken on fact and are taken as having a kind of weight that they might not otherwise have. That kind of ethic within the political discourse is incredibly useful. And I don't think the left would be wise to discard it at this point. And I certainly don't think the self-righteousness of claiming that one has fact on one side is actually doing much for us in this political moment. In fact, what I think is probably doing more for us is the recognition that what we have is multiple perspectives of people with very different life experience, all of whom are oriented towards the same goal and the same aim. And at this point, that's the power that we have to wield. Thank you.
Great, thanks to all three of you, and we have 10 or 12 minutes for questions, so the floor is open. No comments. Please, go ahead.
I enjoyed the conversation, thank you, and it was helpful to be in your course last quarter and talk through some of these things, so I'm curious, is it what particularly is effective or unique about, so you talked about the distance between the speech act and the intention.
Actually, Kevin.
Yes, and then you brought it up,
Yeah.
I think, regarding Derrida, and how that can lead to a political ethic of humility.
Mm-hmm.
So could one come to that ethic in another way? And is that, what would make the Derridian way of getting there? What one would choose over another way of getting to that ethic? Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to diminish any other path to that as a political virtue. But philosophically, I take very seriously certain Derridian critiques of the liberal tradition, and because of that, I want to speak to the kind of virtues of those critiques. If you discount those critiques, which interestingly I found that Professor Hector didn't actually discount the critiques, he discounted what happens when one begins to speak from a position in which you take those critiques for granted. But if you read the argument and you take the critiques seriously, then the question is, are there political? Because people have argued that Derrida was himself fundamentally apolitical, right? So one of the claims I have in the book is that this interest later in his life towards what he calls democracy to come is profoundly political, and that literature is this place in which you actually see exercise the kind of political virtues that he was peddling. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. I think my question on some level is short. It's, can you continue where you left off? Because I think that this point you raised at the end of what's helping the left is not a sort of self-righteous conviction that we have the facts, but actually what will be more beneficial and powerful is to see actually the common goals that different factions have and to actually start working towards that. But I wonder if we could then easily slip into a sense where, well, what are the goals and how do we know that those are the proper goals? And then there can still be a disagreement about what the proper path would be. Does that put us back into the same trap, or are we shifting from fact to value?
What's the trap?
The trap is this sort of ironic relativism that can emerge. So if, for example, the agenda of Bernie Sanders, seems to have elements that a lot of people could get behind, and that would be in tension with a sort of Trump agenda. We're then still going into a place where we have two different views, two different visions, and then how to negotiate that without irony.
So maybe the connection that I need to make is between irony and scrutiny, in the sense that, so the fear seems to be that irony gives us the night in which all cows are black. And the argument that I'm making is actually that the sort of practices that we recognize here are those that involve an insistence on a kind of scrutiny. So let me separate the two arguments, because the argument that I'm making about irony in the book has to do with the way in which irony can be used in two ways. It can be used to create communities. It can be used to reveal the impossibility of one's claims being assumed to be understood in a certain way, the benefits of that kind of practice. So on the one hand, I see a kind of irony that gets used to create inside or outside divides, where we all assume that we know what really is entailed, as a kind of potentially destructive political irony. And this is the irony that I associate certain moments with the way in which Levinas worked within his communities, that if you get it, and this is what I'm talking about, like, the difference between reading within a religious community versus reading within a literary community. If you get it, then you're on the inside. If you don't get it, then you're on the outside. And that also has a nexus of desire, which creates an emphasis of wanting to be on the inside. On the other hand, I think that undermining the stakes of that kind of language, which in some sense is one of the things I think that we need to recognize and undermine in the way that Trump uses a doublespeak. That the doublespeak he uses is very much to create certain kinds of alignments. It's a doublespeak that if you're on his side, it doesn't mean you believe him. In fact, the question of belief is actually not really relevant. The question is only a matter of whether you position yourself on the inside or whether you position yourself on the outside. And then you're aligning with him because he's a figure of power, rather than because he's telling the truth. And so actually to think about critically, and this is one of the things I think is interesting about the way post-structuralism can allow us to talk and think about irony, to think about the way in which irony can be wielded as a political tool, unearth the ways in which discourse disguises power. It covers up power. And that what I see as the sort of the political function of irony is a kind of critical tool against those moments of inclusion and exclusion, in which we think we're talking about truth, but in fact, we're not. Because in fact, the only way in which you can say you get it is not to get it, it's to align yourself on one side versus the other.
What is the relation between irony meant as you are describing right now and what you were mentioning as, like, we know what is the common good that we share, the idea of common good that we can have, and that the opposing part does not have. Can you work with irony with that, or if irony is excluded by that kind of?
Look, I was at the Women's March last Sunday, and there was so much irony in the political signs that I saw, and it was wonderful. And it was wonderful for some of the reasons that I sometimes am critical of, in the sense that if certain of the slogans you laugh at, and the experience of laughing is the experience of being understood, right? And that experience itself creates a kind of political cohesion. But I also would say that one of the things I find kind of energizing, the kind of grassroots expressions that I see being mobilized, is the way in which they're not built on a kind of foundationalist understanding of identity. They're actually built on the performance of certain kinds of identities, and those performances are powerful because they're being criticized. And so they're in play in a kind of game of power and retort, right? And the kind of foundational claims, I am queer because I was born that way, or I am queer because I was, exposed to certain things. Those aren't the debates that are being mobilized. The idea is that in expressing oneself as queer, one is mobilizing a conversation and a power dynamic, and then the irony in its multifaceted dimensions becomes a part of the power about political speech. I see that as incredibly liberating.
So there's a notion that the movement of political correctness embraced by the left has, in a sense, made impossible that move towards ironic discourse, because there's always a danger of insulting, of offending, in being ironic.
This pussy grabs back. That was the most, that's the sign of it. This pussy grabs back. Yeah. That is not a politically correct statement. No, it's not. But it's actually the statement. I mean, the hats, my stepmother, when I showed up at the march, and my daughter had a hat, she said, I don't know how to feel. She said, I don't know how to feel. And I was, it's my 7-year-old wearing a pussy hat. To me, the sense of this army of women, older women, thin women, fat women, dark women, light women, all wearing these hats. And what that actually does to the politically correct movement, because it actually changes it, right? It changes it because the attacks remobilize all of these terms in a way in which they have the political settings that they didn't before. Now, I know I'm sounding like way, and every time I talk about this, I get too celebratory, which is fundamentally problematic. But I do find it exciting to see different forms of political iteration.
So one of the things that I heard in Professor Hector's response was a kind of discussion of what your claims about politics would mean in what I think of as like an institutional political context, and the difficulty of bringing in some of these political claims to like an actual institutional framework and distributing them that way. And I'm wondering, just like if you could follow up on that a little more, like what is, since I take it in Derrida and in your argument about Derrida, the argument of politics to be a politics that extends well beyond institutional frameworks and criticizes institutional frameworks as themselves causing problems of a political nature. What is the relationship between like applicability of this politics and the mechanisms for political application that exist in our institutions? Is there an institutional side to this politics that could be mobilized ever truly, or is it always something that has to be beyond or outside of the institution?
So I feel like of those people who read Derrida politically, I fall somewhere in the middle, which is there are those who see him as having a kind of radical leftist politics, and there are those who see him as being a kind of quietist. And to say that I fall somewhere in the middle is to take seriously that to say that the idea of democracy to come is in fact a kind of endorsement of the liberal tradition. It's an endorsement of the liberal tradition in practice. And it's to say that within the liberal tradition are mobilized what he sees as antinomies, values that are actually fundamentally at odds with each other, like individuality and equality, which are always going to be mobilized against one another. And that the capacity of mobilizing those values against one another is actually the potential of the liberal tradition. And that the liberal tradition is at its best when it mobilizes those antinomies rather than trying to hide them. So do I think that does it mean restructuring institution? No, it means thinking differently about the kind of political agency that's at work in our institutions as we have them, and the potential for using different forms of participation in those institutions. That's where I stand.
So I think we're out of time, but before you move, I want to ask you to join me in thanking the panel, and especially